I first saw Michael at a seminar in college. We both ended up there for extra credits, though our paths were completely different. He was studying business, while I was studying literature. On the surface, these seemed like two entirely unrelated fields, but it was his confidence and charisma that attracted me from the very first glance. When he raised his hand to ask the professor a difficult, almost provocative question, a tense silence fell over the room. His voice was firm but not harsh, and the question was laced with sharp intellect. Everyone, including me, froze, and the professor seemed to momentarily lose his train of thought. After the class, fate seemed to play a trick on us. We accidentally found ourselves in the same cafe. He was standing in line in front of me, and I was trying to decide between a cappuccino and a latte when he turned to me and suggested trying the local specialty tea. From that moment on, it felt as if the universe wanted us to be together. We found a table in the corner and started chatting. The conversation flowed easily and naturally, about everything, from his interest in investments to my favorite books, from his childhood memories of vacations on a farm to my school years spent in a small library. I come from a rather strict background, he said, sipping from his cup. My parents are deeply religious. I shrugged, trying not to show my surprise. My parents are free thinkers. They always taught me to question everything. Michael laughed. It sounds like we're from different planets. Despite our differences, there was an undeniable chemistry between us. We began to see each other more often, spending time studying together and exploring the city on weekends. Every walk, every conversation only deepened our connection. 2 years later, we decided to move in together. It seemed like a practical decision. Our apartments were far from campus, and living together just felt natural. We could no longer imagine a day without each other. But the joy of living together was overshadowed by the reaction of his parents. Dinner at their house turned into a trial. His mother, Mrs. Davis, was the first to voice her concerns. "Michael, you know how we feel about this." Michael shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, times have changed. It doesn't matter that much." His father interjected, looking at us sternly. "In our house, this is considered a sin." I could feel the weight of their gaze and, trying to ease the tension, I said, "We respect your beliefs, but this is our decision. We are adults." Mrs. Davis sighed. "It's just, we didn't raise you this way." Michael squeezed my hand. "Lizzie and I love each other. We want to start our life together, and I hope you can support that." The evening ended on a sad note. Michael and I remained firm in our decision, and a few days later, we moved into a cozy apartment near campus. At first, everything went wonderfully. We were setting up our home, planning our future, cooking dinners together, and enjoying every moment. But the tension in our relationship with his parents lingered in the background, like an old radio playing a sad melody. One evening, as we were getting used to our new life, there was a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Davis, holding a pie. "I thought I'd drop by to see how you're doing," she said, eyeing our apartment with a critical look. "We're doing great, Mrs. Davis," I replied, trying to be polite, though I was feeling tense inside. She placed the pie on the table and, walking around the room, added, "The apartment's small, but cozy." I smiled, though her words sounded more like a reproach. "We like it here," I replied, exchanging a glance with Michael. She continued inspecting the apartment, asking questions about our plans and clearly trying to look into every corner. Michael, noticing my discomfort, politely but firmly said, "Mom, we're glad you stopped by, but please respect our choices." It was a soft statement, but with a firmness that made her fall silent. That evening, she left, leaving behind a strange feeling, a mix of awkwardness and an attempt to connect. She sat across from us at the tiny table, which barely had enough space for her pie. Her gaze drifted over our kitchen as if assessing whether our cabinets were clean enough and whether the shelves were properly organized. After a long silence, Mrs. Davis sighed and said, "This is all temporary. All right, you'll get married soon, and everything will fall into place." Michael cleared his throat. "We're not planning on getting married, Mom." Her eyebrows shot up, and I noticed her lips press into a thin line. However, she didn't say anything, simply turned to the pie and began slicing it. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The constant pressure from Michael's parents was beginning to wear us down. Their expectations felt like an invisible weight, slowly but steadily bearing down on our home. What once were carefree evenings at the cinema or walks in the park began to be overshadowed by the looming expectation of marriage. Every time we met with his parents, I felt that the conversation inevitably veered in that direction, even when they pretended to discuss other topics. One evening, as we were preparing dinner together in our tiny kitchen, Michael suddenly brought up the topic. "Lizzie, have you ever thought about marriage?" I stopped chopping vegetables and looked at him, surprised. "Are you saying you're asking me to marry you?" He smiled awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not exactly. I mean, yes, I want to marry you someday. But right now, it's more about my parents. Maybe if we had some kind of ceremony, they'd back off." I sighed deeply, feeling mixed emotions. "So, you're talking about a wedding without the legal paperwork?" He nodded, his gaze hopeful. "I just thought maybe we could invite friends, make it a fun day. My parents would get their wedding, and we'd get some peace." It wasn't the romantic proposal I had imagined, but I understood his reasoning. "Okay," I replied after a long pause, "but on one condition: we do it our way. No big church wedding, just something small and intimate." A smile of relief lit up his face. "It's a deal." The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of preparations. We picked a beautiful outdoor venue, invited our closest friends and family, and planned a simple, yet heartfelt ceremony. When we shared the news with his parents, their reaction was surprisingly restrained. "An outdoor wedding?" Mrs. Davis asked, raising an eyebrow. "Well, that's unconventional. But if it means you two are taking the next step, I suppose we can support that," Mr. Davis added. "The important thing is to be devoted to each other." The wedding day turned out to be sunny and bright. I chose a simple white dress that was perfect for the atmosphere of our small celebration, and Michael looked stunning in his classic suit. Our friends cheered, raising their glasses to us, and even Michael's parents seemed genuinely happy during the reception. At sunset, Mrs. Davis pulled me aside. "Lizzie, I want to apologize," she said quietly, avoiding my gaze. "I know we've been strict with you too. But seeing you together today, I realized that love is what really matters." Her words touched me. "Thank you, Mrs. Davis," I replied with a smile. "It means a lot to us." That day, for the first time, I felt that maybe the ice was beginning to melt. Everyone was dancing and celebrating our love, and there was a sense in the air that this would be a new beginning for us. But that feeling turned out to be deceptive. As the days went by, visits from his parents became more frequent. They showed up unannounced, often with unsolicited advice or thinly veiled criticism. Instead of the wedding easing their grip on us, it seemed to have given them a new sense of entitlement to interfere in our lives. One morning, while I was still sipping my coffee in my pajamas, the doorbell rang. Standing on the doorstep were Mr. and Mrs. Davis, with another pie in her hands and a small toolbox in his. "We thought you might make use of some improvements around the apartment," she said, stepping over the threshold as if it were her own home. At that moment, I felt like I was on the verge of losing my patience. One evening, as Michael and I were enjoying a quiet moment after a long day, there was a knock at the door. I already knew who it could be before I even got up to open it. Mrs. Davis was standing at the door, holding a casserole dish. "I just thought I'd bring over some dinner," she said with a smile that seemed more forced than sincere. "Thank you," I replied, accepting the dish. But you know you don't have to do this. She waved her hand dismissively, as though brushing off my words. It's no trouble. I just thought, since you and Michael are so busy, you might not have time to cook. I forced a smile, feeling the hidden judgment in her words. We're managing, but thank you anyway. When the door closed, I sighed deeply. Michael came over and hugged me. It'll be okay, he whispered. But okay only seemed to get worse. Mrs. Davis's visits became increasingly filled with subtle comments that chipped away at my patience more and more. She would ask seemingly innocent questions, which still came across as criticism. Why is the house so messy? Haven't you thought of making something more nutritious? One day, after coming home exhausted from work, I found her in our living room rearranging books on the shelves. Mrs. Davis, what are you doing? I asked, frozen in the doorway. She looked at me as if her actions were completely natural. I just thought I'd tidy up a little. These shelves looked so cluttered. Michael walked out of the kitchen with 2 cups of tea in hand, and upon noticing me, he said, Mom's just helping Lizzie. I took a deep breath, feeling my patience slipping away. This is our home, Michael. We didn't ask for help. Mrs. Davis pursed her lips, her eyes briefly flashing. I'm just trying to be helpful. After all, now we're one family. Instead of comforting me, her words only added fuel to the fire. Her interference was becoming more frequent, and the boundaries were growing ever more blurred. She and Mr. Davis would show up unannounced, giving advice we hadn't asked for, criticizing our decisions, and commenting on our daily habits. One evening, after an especially difficult visit from his parents, I couldn't take it anymore. Michael and I sat down to talk. Michael, this has to stop, I began with a voice shaking from frustration. I can't live like this anymore. I feel like I'm constantly being judged in my own home. He ran his fingers through his hair, looking just as tense as I felt. I know, Lizzie. It's just, they're my parents. I don't know how to tell them to back off without hurting their feelings. And what about our feelings? I retorted. Our peace. We can't keep sacrificing that for them. After a long conversation, we made a decision. A week later, we invited his parents over for dinner to address everything openly. The evening started off quite pleasantly. We chatted about work, friends, and the latest news. Mrs. Davis seemed unusually pleased, especially when she noticed I had served one of her signature dishes. But when it came time for the main course, I knew the conversation couldn't be postponed any longer. I took a deep breath, trying to collect my thoughts, and began. Mrs. Davis, Mr. Davis, we invited you here because there's something we need to discuss. Mr. Davis paused with his fork in midair, frowning. What's going on? I met Michael's gaze, and he nodded, encouraging me. It's about the frequent visits and the constant influence on our lives. The words hung in the air, like a loud echo. Mrs. Davis folded her napkin in her lap, her face growing serious. I could feel the tension building in the room, like a rope stretched to its breaking point. Mrs. Davis looked stunned. She nervously crumpled the napkin in her hands, her eyes darting between me and Michael, as though trying to find the support she seemed to be losing. We're just trying to help, she finally said, her voice trembling. Michael, you know we've always wanted the best for you. We care about you, both of you. We appreciate your concern, I replied, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. But this is becoming unbearable. We need space to live our lives, make our mistakes, and grow together. Tears welled up in Mrs. Davis's eyes. She looked at Michael reproachfully. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us. Mr. Davis, who had been silent until then, added in his stern voice. We're just looking out for you, Michael. It seems like Lizzie doesn't appreciate family here. The words hit me like a blow. I felt a pang of guilt, but I knew I couldn't back down. It's not about gratitude, it's about respect, I said firmly. Respect for our boundaries and our choices. The room fell silent. The tension was almost palpable. Mrs. Davis dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, her shoulders shaking slightly. We just wanted to be part of your lives. I never thought it would come to this. Michael looked torn, his loyalty clearly divided between us and his parents. But he stood his ground. Mom, we love you, he said softly, but this is our life. We want you to understand that. The evening ended on a bitter note. Mrs. Davis left in tears, and Mr. Davis, looking disappointed, silently agreed that something needed to change. When the door closed behind them, I felt a mix of emotions, relief and dread, as I thought about what the future might hold for our relationship. In the following days, the house became unusually quiet. The constant visits stopped, but the silence felt both relieving and accusing. Every time the doorbell rang or there was a knock, my heart would race, expecting to see Michael's parents on the doorstep. But it never happened. One evening, as we sat on the couch, Michael unexpectedly brought up the topic. Lizzie, do you think we were too harsh? He asked, his voice full of doubt. They are still my parents. Maybe we reacted too strongly. I took his hand, feeling its warm weight. Michael, it's not about being rude, it's about setting boundaries. We did what we had to do. He sighed deeply, shaking his head. I know, it's just hard. I never imagined I'd be in this situation with them. As the days passed and weeks turned into months, we began to feel the weight of our decision. There were no more unexpected visits, but there were also no calls or messages. It seemed like our connection with his parents had completely severed. During this time, I often found comfort in little daydreams. Sometimes, I'd spend hours scrolling through real estate listings online, imagining how we could start fresh. One day, while scrolling through a website, I saw a house that caught my attention. It had a large garden, a spacious living room, and most importantly, it was far from our current life. Michael, come look at this, I called to him, and he came over to look at the screen. Wow, it's beautiful. But why are you looking at houses? I hesitated, searching for the right words. I was thinking, maybe it's time to start over, in a new place where we can create our own memories. Away from all this drama. He looked surprised. You mean move? Leave everything behind? I nodded. It's drastic, I know. But maybe it's what we need. We spent a long time discussing the idea, weighing the pros and cons. It was tempting, but also frightening. And yet, the more we talked about it, the more we felt like it might be the right decision. A few weeks later, Michael and I visited the house I had found online. In person, it was even more beautiful, spacious rooms bathed in soft light, windows opening to a neatly trimmed garden, and the faint scent of freshly mowed grass in the air. The surrounding neighborhood left a lasting impression on me. Quiet streets with houses nestled in greenery, it felt like the embodiment of peace. After much thought, I decided to use the money I had inherited from my grandmother to buy the house. The day we signed the papers, I had mixed feelings. I was excited for the new chapter, but also saddened to leave behind everything that connected us to our old life. The move went surprisingly smoothly, and soon we were settling into our new home. It felt like a dream. The silence, the peace, the morning awakenings to the sound of birdsong, everything filled my soul with serenity. One evening, while we were enjoying a quiet dinner in our new dining room, Michael looked at me with a smile. Lizzie, I think this is the best decision we've ever made. I smiled back, feeling warmth spread through my chest. I think so too. The first few months in the new house felt like a dream. Our morning routines, long walks around the neighborhood, and peaceful evenings became part of our new life. The past felt like a distant memory, and the tension that once clouded our days had vanished. But that peace didn't last long. One evening, I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. A doorbell rang from the next room. I heard Michael go to answer, and then his surprised voice. "Mom?" My heart stopped as I heard Mrs. Davis's familiar voice. I hurried to the door and stood frozen on the threshold, stunned by what I saw. There, on our doorstep, stood Mrs. and Mr. Davis, with suitcases in hand. "Mom, Dad, what are you doing here?" Michael asked, his voice full of surprise. Mrs. Davis smiled her signature, slightly forced smile. "We missed you, dear, and we thought, why not visit you?" I tried to maintain my composure, although inside everything tightened. "This is unexpected," I managed to say. Mr. Davis intervened, his voice dry but calm. "We just wanted to know where our son is living now." "Is that so wrong?" Michael looked confused. "Of course not, but it would have been nice if you'd given us a heads up." Mrs. Davis began looking around, her eyes scanning the rooms as though she was evaluating every corner. "What a lovely house," she remarked, her voice sounding slightly mocking. "Much better than your old place." I felt tension building, but said nothing. Their visit turned into a stay. One night became 2, then 3. They began to feel just as comfortable in our home as they had in the old one, as if the move had never happened. One evening, after dinner, I pulled Michael aside. "We can't go down this road again, Michael," I said, barely holding back my disappointment. "We moved to avoid this." He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples tiredly. "I know, Lizzie. But they're my parents. I can't just kick them out." "Then what?" I asked sharply. "Are we going to let them take over our lives again?" And just at that moment, as if overhearing our conversation, Mrs. Davis appeared in the living room. Her eyes were full of tears, and she looked stunned. "Is this how you feel, Michael?" Her voice trembled. "That we're a burden?" Michael helplessly looked at me, then back at his mother. "Mom, it's not like that. We just wanted you to tell us when you're coming." She sniffled, as though trying to make him feel guilty. "We just wanted to be closer to our son, but it seems we're not welcome here either." My heart clenched as I heard Mr. Davis add, "By the way, we've made a decision about our living situation." A feeling of dread began to rise in me. Michael and I sat in tense silence, like we were waiting for a storm, when Mr. Davis, sitting upright with a stern expression, spoke. "We have some news." Michael shifted in his chair, the tension obvious on his face. "Go ahead," he said cautiously. Mrs. Davis, trying to sound cheerful, though her voice was unnatural, interjected. "We sold our house. We realized it's no longer necessary because now we have such a lovely family home here, with you too." My eyes widened in shock. You sold your house?" My voice came out almost in a whisper. "We wanted to be closer to you," Mr. Davis explained, looking serious and even somewhat smug. Seeing our reaction, Mrs. Davis pursed her lips and added, "We're family. Why don't you want us here?" I took a deep breath. This was the moment I had been avoiding for far too long. "Listen," I began, trying to keep my voice steady but firm. "This house is mine. It's registered solely in my name." With those words, I stood up, went to the office, and returned with a folder. I opened it and showed them the property documents. Mrs. Davis took the papers, looked them over, and gave me a stunned look. "But you're married," she said, her voice trembling. "What's yours is Michael's." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but a triumphant smile appeared on my face. "That's where you're wrong," I said, looking her directly in the eye. "We had a ceremony, yes, but Michael and I never made our marriage official. We never signed any documents." Mr. Davis froze, shifting his gaze from me to Michael, as if hoping for a contradiction. But Michael, to my relief, took my hand, showing his support. "It's true, Mom, Dad," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We had the ceremony for ourselves and for those who wanted to celebrate our love, but we didn't feel the need to involve the government in our relationship." Mrs. Davis began to cry, pressing a tissue to her eyes. "So you lied to us, and now you're throwing us out?" A heavy tension filled the room. Michael's parents seemed unable to process what they had just heard. Shock quickly turned into outrage. "You deceived everyone with a fake wedding," Mrs. Davis spat, her voice trembling with anger. "And now you think this will fix everything?" Michael sighed. "It's not about deception, Mom. It's about how we wanted to live our lives. You dare challenge the sanctity of marriage?" Mr. Davis interrupted. "Live together in sin, and then mock us with this fake wedding? That's enough." He stood up from his chair, his face turning red with fury. "You, young lady, are nothing but a sinner trying to tear my son away from his family and values." I trembled at his words, but I didn't let them break me. "I haven't taken Michael from anyone," I replied coldly. "He made his own choice, and it's high time you respected that." Mrs. Davis sniffled, but her voice remained firm. "Michael, come home with us. Leave this woman. She's done nothing but trap you in her web of lies." Michael, who had maintained his composure throughout the growing storm, finally broke the silence. "Mom, Dad, I love both of you." His voice was firm but full of pain. "But my place is here, with Lizzie. She's been kind and understanding, even when both of you weren't. You can't just demand that I leave her. You're choosing her over us." Mr. Davis's voice was filled with anger and disbelief. "I'm choosing to live my life on my own terms," Michael declared. These words came like a final declaration in a long-standing conflict. The room fell silent, heavy and suffocating, as if the air had thickened to the point where each breath was difficult. Mrs. Davis's face became a mask of pain and betrayal. "Well then," she finally said, her voice cold as an icy wind. "Remember this, Michael. You're turning your back on your family, on your faith. And all for her." "I'm not turning my back on anyone, Mom," Michael replied, his voice steady, though you could hear the deep fatigue in it. "I just want you to understand that I have the right to my own life." Mrs. Davis looked at him harshly, her eyes filled with bitterness and hurt. "Let it be then," she said, turning to her husband. "Let's go." Without sparing us another glance, she left the house, followed by Mr. Davis. Their footsteps faded, leaving behind a heavy trail of hurt, confusion, and uncertainty. I looked at Michael. His face mirrored my own feelings, a mix of pain, disappointment, and the understanding that our life had changed irreversibly. We both knew there was no turning back. A few days after that confrontation, on my way home from work, I heard the voice of my neighbor, Mrs. Carlson. She was standing by her fence, as usual, waiting for someone to chat with. "Lizzie, have you heard the Devises sold their house?" I stopped, surprised by the question. "Yes, of course, they mentioned it. Why do you ask?" Mrs. Carlson leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Susan told me that Janice, who works at the real estate agency, checked the records. Their house was never listed for sale." The words hit me like a thunderclap. "Are you sure?" I asked, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "Absolutely, dear. No records." When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about this information. I shared the news with Michael. His face froze in shock, then something like sadness appeared. "They lied to us," he said finally. "What were they trying to achieve?" We both knew the answer, though it was bitter. They had tried to manipulate us, using lies to pull us back into their lives. "We need strong boundaries," I said firmly. Michael nodded. You're right. We can't keep going like this. It's harmful to us and our relationship. The next day, he decided to meet with his parents face to face. He left the house with determination but returned with a heavy heart. They admitted it, he said, his voice quiet, almost weary. They sold the lie because they were afraid of being alone. They thought that if they moved in with us, we'd be one big family again. We sat down and discussed our next steps for a long time. It was clear that, for the sake of our peace of mind and sanity, we needed to distance ourselves. We need a break, Michael said. Some time away from all this drama. I agreed. That evening, we sent a message to his parents explaining that we needed time and space. The response we received was filled with anger and accusations, but we stood firm. The next few weeks were peaceful. We focused on each other, trying to rebuild the trust and closeness that had been so damaged over the past months. Our days were filled with little joys, shared dinners, walks in the garden, and conversations under the stars. One evening, sitting on the porch of our house, Michael turned to me. Thank you, Lizzie, he whispered. Thank you for being here, for fighting for us. I smiled, holding his hand tightly. Always, Michael. We looked up at the night sky, the stars twinkling like tiny beacons of hope. Our path hadn't been easy, but it had become a reminder of how important boundaries, honesty, and mutual respect are. And despite everything we had been through, we remained strong and ready to move forward.